Admiral Susan Brooks was having breakfast in her quarters when the emergency message arrived at Human Fleet Headquarters. The transmission was broken and filled with static, but the words "hospital ship under attack" came through clearly enough. She dropped her coffee and ran to the command center, still wearing her sleeping clothes. The message had taken 4 hours to reach the nearest human military base. By the time Susan received it, the Hope's Light had been under Korath control for most of a day. She quickly checked the location of every human ship in the area and found that 3 vessels could reach the hospital ship within 12 hours. Captain Pete Williams was commanding the hospital ship Mercy's Grace when he received orders to change course immediately. His ship carried medical supplies and additional doctors that could help treat the patients aboard the Hope's Light. Pete pushed his engines beyond safe limits to cut travel time from 15 hours to 10. The battleship Righteous Fury was closest to the attack site. Captain Rita Nelson had been patrolling the border between human and neutral space when the emergency call came through. She ordered her ship to maximum speed and called for 2 other warships to join her. The human military took attacks on medical vessels very seriously. Back aboard the Hope's Light, Dr. Lisa Park was still working in the surgical suites under Korath guard. She had been operating continuously for 18 hours, stopping only to eat energy bars and drink water. 2 patients had died during the attack when their life support systems failed, and Lisa was determined not to lose anyone else. The Korath soldiers assigned to watch her had stopped pointing their weapons. After the first few hours, they could see that she was completely focused on saving lives and posed no threat to anyone. Some of them had even started helping by handing her surgical instruments when she needed them. Ben Carter was coordinating the medical response to injuries caused by the attack itself. Several crew members had been hurt when the missiles hit, and 3 Korath patients had been injured by falling debris. He treated everyone equally, including the soldiers who had invaded his ship. A young Korath soldier named Veltar had been cut by flying metal when the boarding party broke through the hull. Ben cleaned and bandaged the wound while explaining what he was doing. Veltar was amazed that an enemy medic would treat him with such care after his people had attacked the ship. Commander Thexvar spent hours walking through different sections of the Hope's Light, trying to find evidence that would justify his attack. Instead, he found more proof that the humans were exactly what they claimed to be. Every room was filled with medical equipment, medicine, or supplies needed to care for patients. The ship's food storage areas contained special meals designed for dozens of different alien species. The humans had learned the dietary requirements of every race they might encounter and kept appropriate food in stock. Some of the meals were expensive and difficult to prepare, but they were necessary for certain patients to heal properly. Amy Torres worked with Carl Johnson to repair the communications equipment damaged in the attack. They used spare parts from non-essential systems to rebuild the transmitter. Amy wanted to contact the rescue ships she hoped were coming, but she also needed to send medical updates to the families of patients aboard the ship. Carl had been forced to work alongside Korath engineers who were still searching for hidden military technology. The alien engineers were skilled with machinery, and Carl found himself teaching them about human medical equipment design. They were impressed by the innovative solutions humans had developed to treat multiple alien species. 3 Korath soldiers were helping to carry patients between medical bays when the ship's sensors detected incoming vessels. Captain Morrison was brought to the bridge, where he could see 3 human warships approaching at high speed. The lead ship was broadcasting human military identification codes. Commander Thexvar realized that he was about to face the consequences of his decision to attack a neutral medical vessel. Human warships were some of the most advanced in the galaxy, and he had only 3 vessels to face them. Worse, his own ships were not prepared for battle because they had been focused on boarding operations. Captain Rita Nelson opened a communication channel with the Korath ships as soon as she was in range. Her voice was calm, but carried the authority of someone who commanded a powerful warship. She demanded an immediate explanation for the attack on a hospital vessel protected by galactic treaties. Thexvar found himself in an impossible position. He could not explain his actions without admitting that he had made a terrible mistake. The evidence was clear that the Hope's light was exactly what it appeared to be. He had attacked innocent medical personnel and put hundreds of patients at risk based on his own suspicious nature. Dr. Lisa Park finished another surgery and learned that help was arriving. The Mercy's Grace carried additional medical equipment that could replace what had been damaged in the attack. More importantly, it had fresh medical staff who could take over for the exhausted doctors aboard the Hope's Light. Ben Carter began preparing for the evacuation of the most seriously injured patients. Some of them needed medical care that could only be provided on a ship with undamaged equipment. He worked with Korath soldiers to identify which patients should be moved first. The cooperation between human medical staff and Korath soldiers had grown stronger throughout the day. The soldiers had seen how hard the humans worked to save lives, including Korath lives. Many of them began to question why their people were fighting against such dedicated healers. Sergeant Krelnox had spent the day helping to move patients and carry medical supplies. He had watched human doctors exhaust themselves to save alien patients who could never repay them. The experience had changed his understanding of what it meant to be an enemy. Amy Torres successfully re-established communication with the outside world just as the human warships arrived. Her first messages were not requests for military assistance, but updates on patient conditions and requests for specific medical supplies. Even under attack, the medical mission came first. The hospital ship Mercy's Grace docked with the Hope's Light while the warships maintained a defensive position around both vessels. Captain Pete Williams led a team of fresh doctors and nurses aboard the damaged ship. They were shocked by the extent of the damage, but impressed by how well the medical staff had maintained patient care. Commander Thexvar watched human reinforcements arrive and realized that his attack had failed in every possible way. He had not found any evidence of wrongdoing. He had damaged a legitimate medical facility, and he had probably started a diplomatic incident that would make the war worse for his people. The most painful part was knowing that he had been wrong about the humans. They were not secret enemies or military collaborators. They were healers who risked their lives to help anyone who needed medical care, regardless of species or politics. The attack on the Hope's Light would be remembered as a shameful moment in Korath military history. Sergeant Krelnox stopped walking when he entered the main medical bay. The Korath soldier had fought in dozens of battles and seen many terrible things, but nothing had prepared him for what he found inside the human hospital ship. His weapon hung forgotten in his hands as he stared at the rows of beds filled with patients. The first thing Krelnox noticed was the smell. Instead of the metal and oil scent he expected on a military vessel, the air smelled clean and medicinal. Soft lights illuminated the large room, and quiet machines beeped steadily as they monitored the patients. Human medical staff moved between the beds with calm efficiency. What shocked Krelnox the most was seeing his own people lying in the beds. Korath soldiers and civilians were being treated alongside their supposed enemies. A young Korath female with bandaged arms lay next to an elderly Zalani male. Both were sleeping peacefully under the care of human doctors. Dr. Lisa Park approached the armed soldiers without showing any fear. Her surgical gown was stained with blood from multiple operations, and her face showed the exhaustion of someone who had been working for many hours without rest. She looked directly at Krelnox and spoke in careful Korath language. Lisa asked if any of the soldiers were injured and needed medical attention. Her pronunciation was not perfect, but Krelnox could understand her clearly. The question confused him. These humans had just been attacked by his people, yet the first thing this doctor wanted to know was if she could help them. Behind Lisa, other human medical staff continued their work as if armed enemy soldiers had not just invaded their ship. A nurse checked the breathing of a Korath child who had been burned in a factory accident. Another doctor examined the healing wounds of a Zalani soldier who had lost his leg in battle. Krelnox walked slowly between the beds, trying to understand what he was seeing. His training had taught him that enemies helped each other only when they shared common goals, but these humans seemed to be helping everyone equally, regardless of which side they came from in the war. Commander Thexvar entered the medical bay with more soldiers behind him. The Korath commander had expected to find weapons or military supplies hidden among fake medical equipment. Instead, he found the largest hospital he had ever seen floating in space. Thexvar demanded to speak with the person in charge of the medical operations. Ben Carter stepped forward and identified himself as the chief medical officer. He was a calm man who had dealt with difficult situations before, but never while enemy soldiers pointed weapons at his staff. Ben explained that the Hope's Light was treating 847 patients from 17 different species. He showed Thexvar the medical records on his tablet, which listed every patient by species and injury type. The commander was surprised to see that 127 of the patients were Korath citizens. The numbers did not make sense to Thexvar. If the humans were helping the Zalani forces, why were they treating more Korath patients than enemy casualties? He demanded to see the ship's medical logs to find evidence of the deception he was certain existed. Amy Torres was brought to the medical bay under guard. Her communications equipment had been destroyed in the attack, but she carried backup data files that contained all of the ship's recent activities. She showed the Korath commander the rescue missions they had completed over the past month. Records showed that the Hope's Light had responded to distress calls from both sides of the war. They had rescued Korath survivors from a damaged space station and treated Zalani refugees from a bombed colony. In every case, the humans had provided medical care without asking questions about politics or military allegiance. Thexvar studied the medical files and found detailed notes about treatments that had been developed specifically for Korath physiology. Human doctors had modified their surgical techniques to work better with Korath biology. They had even invented new medicines that were more effective for his people than traditional Korath treatments. Carl Johnson was forced to show Korath engineers through the ship's technical systems. They were looking for hidden weapons or military communication equipment. Instead, they found medical machines that had been modified to support alien patients with different biological needs. The ship's engineering spaces were filled with equipment that cleaned different types of atmosphere and generated the various gases that alien species needed to breathe. Carl had spent years learning how to maintain systems that could support the medical needs of dozens of different alien races. One of the Korath engineers found a manufacturing unit that produced artificial blood for emergency transfusions. The machine could create blood that was compatible with any known species, including types that were chemically impossible for most civilizations to produce. The humans had built it from scratch using their own technology. Dr. Lisa Park was allowed to return to her patients, but Korath soldiers followed her to observe her work. She went immediately to check on a Korath miner who had been brought in with severe internal injuries. The man was conscious and recognized the soldiers as his own people. The injured miner spoke to the soldiers in their native language. He told them that the human doctors had saved his life when his own people could not help him. The Hope's Light had traveled for 6 days to reach him, using expensive fuel and medical supplies to rescue one person who could contribute nothing to their cause. Krell Knox listened to the miner's story and felt confused. His military training told him that enemies did not risk their lives to save a single person unless that person had strategic value. But this injured miner was nobody important, just a worker who had been hurt in an accident. Ben Carter continued his normal medical rounds while the Korath soldiers watched. He checked on patients, reviewed treatment plans, and coordinated with his medical staff. He treated Korath and Zalani patients with exactly the same level of care and attention. Commander Thexvar found himself in the children's ward where young patients from both sides of the war were recovering from their injuries. Human nurses had given the children toys and games to help them feel less frightened. Zalani and Korath children played together under the supervision of medical staff. The sight of enemy children playing peacefully together troubled Thexvar more than anything else he had seen. In his culture, the children of enemies were taught to hate each other from birth. But here, removed from the influences of war, they acted like children everywhere, interested only in games and friendship. A young Korath girl with a bandaged head ran up to Thexvar and hugged his leg. She spoke in the simple language that children use and told him that the human doctors had fixed her head after she fell down. She was not afraid of him, even though he carried weapons and wore battle armor. Thexvar realized that he had made a terrible mistake. These humans were not secret military operatives or enemy collaborators. They were medical professionals who treated anyone who needed help, regardless of politics or species. The attack on the Hope's Light was not just illegal under galactic law, it was morally wrong. The first missile came without warning. The Hope's Light shuddered as the explosion ripped through the outer hull near the cargo bay. Emergency alarms screamed throughout the ship as lights flickered and went out in several sections. Captain Jake Morrison was drinking coffee in his quarters when the impact threw him against the wall. Morrison ran to the bridge as fast as he could. His coffee cup lay broken on the floor, but he did not stop to look at it. The emergency lighting cast red shadows everywhere as crew members rushed to their stations. Amy Torres was already at her communications console trying to find out what had happened. Dr. Lisa Park was in the middle of surgery when the ship shook violently. She grabbed the operating table to keep from falling as medical instruments scattered across the floor. The patient on the table was a young Zalani girl who needed emergency surgery to remove metal fragments from her chest. Lisa looked at her surgical team and made a quick decision. The lights went out for 3 seconds before the emergency power came on. Lisa picked up her surgical tools and continued the operation. The little girl's life depended on her staying calm and focused. Around her, nurses and assistants worked to clean up the scattered equipment and restore normal lighting to the surgical suite. On the bridge, Morrison stared at the main screen in disbelief. 3 Korath warships hung in space directly ahead of the Hope's Light. They were military vessels with dark hulls and weapon ports that glowed with deadly energy. Morrison had never seen Korath ships this close to a hospital vessel before. Amy Torres worked frantically at her console trying to establish communication with the attacking ships. The Korath were not responding to her calls, but she could see that they were charging their weapons for another attack. The hospital ship had no shields and no weapons to defend itself. The second wave of missiles struck the Hope's Light along the engine section. Carl Johnson felt the deck plates buckle under his feet as he ran through the engineering spaces. Sparks flew from damaged control panels, and the smell of burning electronics filled the air. 3 of his engineers were unconscious on the floor, injured by flying debris. Carl ignored his own cuts and bruises as he worked to keep the ship's life support systems running. The missiles had damaged the main power grid, and several medical bays were losing atmosphere through hull breaches. He rerouted power from non-essential systems to maintain the environmental controls that kept hundreds of patients alive. Ben Carter was in the main medical bay when the second attack hit. The force of the explosion knocked him down, and when he stood up, he saw that several patients had been thrown from their beds. A Korath patient with a healing chest wound was bleeding again, and a Zalani female was crying in pain from a broken arm. Ben called for all available medical staff to help with the new injuries. The attack had created more patients, even as it threatened the lives of those already under their care. He moved quickly from bed to bed, checking on the most seriously injured while directing nurses to help the others. Morrison finally managed to get a communication channel open to the lead Korath ship. The face that appeared on his screen belonged to Commander Thexvar, a scarred veteran with cold yellow eyes. The Korath commander looked angry and suspicious as he stared at the human captain. Commander Thexvar demanded that the Hope's Light surrender immediately. He accused the hospital ship of carrying weapons and supplies for the Zalani forces. Morrison tried to explain that they were a neutral medical vessel, but the Korath commander did not want to listen to explanations. Amy Torres managed to send one emergency message before the communications array exploded in a shower of sparks. The message would take hours to reach the nearest human base, but it was their only hope of rescue. She watched her equipment die and felt helpless as the ship fell silent in space. The Korath ships moved closer to the Hope's light and extended docking arms. Commander Thexvar was planning to board the hospital ship and search it personally. He was convinced that the humans were lying about their peaceful mission. In his mind, no one risked their lives to help strangers without getting something in return. Dr. Lisa Park finally finished the surgery on the young Zalani girl, just as armed Korath soldiers began cutting through the hull in 3 different places. She could hear the sound of energy torches melting through the ship's armor, but she did not stop working. The little girl needed careful monitoring for the next few hours, or she might still die. Carl Johnson worked desperately to maintain life support as the ship lost more atmosphere through the new holes being cut in the hull. He sealed off damaged sections and redirected airflow to keep the medical bays pressurized. Every breath his patients took depended on his ability to keep the environmental systems working. Ben Carter gathered his medical staff and prepared them for what was coming. The Korath soldiers would be armed and probably frightened. He told his people to remain calm and continue treating patients no matter what happened. Their job was to save lives, not to fight wars. Morrison watched the cutting torches work through his ship's hull and felt anger rising in his chest. The Hope's light was clearly marked as a hospital ship. It carried no weapons and posed no threat to anyone. The attack was not only illegal under galactic law, but it was also putting hundreds of innocent patients at risk. The first Korath soldiers broke through into the cargo bay and found medical supplies and equipment. They had expected to find weapons or military gear, but instead they saw boxes of medicine, surgical instruments, and emergency food supplies. The soldiers looked confused as they searched through the harmless cargo. Amy Torres tried to restart the communication system, but too much damage had been done. The Hope's light was now cut off from the outside universe with 3 enemy warships surrounding it. She could only hope that her emergency message had gotten through before the equipment failed. Commander Thexvar led his boarding party through the ship's corridors toward the main medical bays. He expected to find evidence that the humans were helping the Zalani war effort. Instead, he was about to discover something that would change his understanding of these strange creatures called humans. The Korath soldiers reached the entrance to the main medical bay just as Dr. Lisa Park emerged from surgery. She was still, wearing her surgical gown, and her hands were stained with green Korath blood from an operation she had performed earlier that day. She looked at the armed soldiers without fear and asked if any of them needed medical attention. Behind her, the medical bay was full of patients from both sides of the war. Zalani and Korath civilians lay in beds next to each other, all receiving the same careful treatment from human doctors and nurses. The scene was not what Commander Thexvar had expected to find aboard an enemy vessel. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the large window on the bridge of the Hope's Light and looked out at the stars. The hospital ship moved slowly through space in the neutral zone between 2 warring alien races. Jake had been captain of this ship for 3 years now, and every day brought new challenges. Today would be no different. The Hope's Light was not like other ships that traveled through this part of space. It carried no weapons, no soldiers, and no military equipment. Instead, the massive vessel was filled with medical bays, surgical rooms, and recovery wards. Every deck of the ship was designed to save lives, not take them. Dr. Lisa Park walked through the main medical bay, checking on her patients. She was a small woman with kind eyes and steady hands. Lisa had worked on hospital ships for 8 years, but nothing had prepared her for the scale of suffering she saw in this war. The conflict between the Zalani Empire and the Korath Federation had been going on for 2 years, and it showed no signs of ending. The medical bay was huge, almost, the size of a football field. Rows of beds held patients from many different alien species. Some looked almost human, while others were so strange that Lisa had needed special training to treat them. But pain was the same in every language, and she had learned to recognize it in all its forms. Ben Carter, the chief medical officer, made his morning rounds through the ship. He was a tall man with gray hair and a calm voice that could soothe even the most frightened patient. Ben carried a tablet that showed the status of every patient on the ship. The numbers were staggering. They currently had 847 patients from 17 different species. Ben stopped at the bed of a young Zilani female who had been brought in yesterday. Her blue skin was pale from blood loss, but the human doctors had managed to save her life. She looked up at Ben with large, purple eyes and tried to speak. Ben did not understand her language, but he could see the gratitude in her expression. In another section of the medical bay, a Korath soldier lay unconscious in a healing tank. His thick, scaled skin had been burned by energy weapons in the last battle. The Korath were supposed to be enemies of the Zilani, but here on the Hope's Light, there were no enemies. There were only patients who needed help. Amy Torres sat at her station in the communications room. She was responsible for talking to both sides of the war. Every morning, she sent reports to the Zilani Empire and the Korath Federation about the patients they had rescued. Both governments had signed agreements that hospital ships were neutral and could not be attacked. Amy looked at her screens and saw messages from refugee camps, battle zones, and damaged space stations. All of them were asking for help. The Hope's Light could only be in one place at a time, but the need seemed endless. She marked the most urgent requests and sent them to Captain Morrison for review. The ship's chief engineer, Carl Johnson, worked in the lower decks where the medical equipment hummed and buzzed day and night. Carl was a practical man who had spent his whole career keeping ships running. The Hope's Light was his greatest challenge yet. Every system on the ship had been modified to support medical operations. Carl checked the power readings for the surgical suites. The alien patients often needed different atmospheric conditions, gravity levels, and temperatures to heal properly. The ship's systems had to work perfectly all the time because a power failure could kill dozens of patients in minutes. He walked past rows of machines that cleaned the air, purified water, and generated the special gases that some alien species needed to breathe. Carl had learned more about alien biology in the past 3 years than most scientists learned in their entire careers. Every species had different needs, and the Hope's Light tried to meet them all. Dr. Lisa Park entered surgical suite number 3 where her next patient was waiting. The patient was a Korath mining worker who had been injured in an accident on an asteroid. His leg had been crushed, and the local medical facilities could not help him. The Hope's Light had traveled for 6 days to reach him. Lisa scrubbed her hands and put on her surgical gear. The operating room was filled with equipment from a dozen different worlds. Some machines were designed for human medicine, while others had been built specifically for alien patients. Lisa had learned to use them all. The Korath patient was unconscious on the table. His breathing was slow and labored. Lisa studied the scans of his injured leg and planned her approach. Korath bones were much denser than human bones, and their blood was green instead of red. But the basic principles of surgery were the same across all species. Captain Morrison walked through the refugee quarters where families waited to be reunited or transported to safety. These were not patients, but people who had lost their homes in the war. The Hope's Light picked them up whenever possible and took them to neutral worlds where they could start new lives. A group of Zilani children played with toys that the human crew had made for them. Their parents watched nervously, still not sure if they could trust these strange humans who helped everyone equally. Morrison smiled at the children and remembered why he had chosen to captain a hospital ship instead of a warship. Ben Carter joined Morrison as they walked through the ship. The two men had worked together for many years and understood each other without needing to speak much. Ben handed Morrison the daily report showing patient numbers, supply levels, and medical outcomes. Morrison read the report carefully. They had lost 2 patients yesterday, but saved 15 others. The mathematics of life and death were always harsh on a hospital ship. Every decision could mean the difference between someone living or dying. Amy Torres received a priority message. From a battle zone 3 days away, a transport ship carrying civilians had been damaged and was drifting in space. The passengers needed immediate medical attention, but both military fleets were too busy fighting to help them. Morrison made the decision quickly. The Hope's light would go to the damaged transport ship. They would probably arrive too late to save everyone, but they had to try. That was what hospital ships did. They went where others could not or would not go. Carl Johnson began preparing the ship for emergency jump to faster-than-light travel. The medical equipment had to be secured, and the patients had to be prepared for the stress of rapid acceleration. Some of the more fragile patients might not survive the journey, but more would die if they did not respond to the distress call. As the Hope's light changed course toward the battle zone, none of the crew knew they were being watched. Far away, hidden behind an asteroid, a Korath military ship tracked their movement. The Korath commander had been following the hospital ship for 3 days, convinced that it was secretly helping his enemies. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. The Coalition fleet attacked with everything they had, and for the first time in the war, the Voidborn could not respond as one. Captain Jake Morrison watched from the bridge of the USS Liberty as thousands of alien ships poured fire into the confused enemy fleet. Centauri heavy cruisers unleashed their massive cannons. Altarian battle groups dove through gaps in the enemy formation. Rigel Federation destroyers launched waves of missiles into clusters of helpless Voidborn vessels. "Sir," Ryan Brooks reported from his tactical station, "the enemy fleet is completely disorganized. Ships are firing at each other, some are trying to retreat, others are just floating in space." Commander Lisa Parker smiled as she watched the battle unfold. "The virus we planted in their network is spreading faster than they can stop it." Morrison nodded. The Liberty had done something no military strategist had ever imagined possible. They had not destroyed the enemy's ability to fight. They had destroyed their ability to think as one mind. "Danny," Morrison called to his chief. "Engineer, how is our cyber attack progressing?" Chief Engineer Danny Walsh looked up from his console with excitement in his eyes. "Sir, it is better than we hoped. The Voidborn network was designed for perfect efficiency. It cannot handle random human thoughts. Every time they try to restore order, our programs introduce more chaos." Through the bridge windows, Morrison could see the battle raging all around them. The Liberty was still in the center of the enemy fleet, but now the Voidborn ships were too confused to coordinate an attack on the small human vessel. "Sir," Communications Officer Beth Adams called out, "I am receiving transmissions from the enemy ships." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "They are trying to communicate?" "Yes, sir, but the messages are very strange. Put them through." The speakers filled with alien voices speaking in languages the translation computers had never heard before. Some were asking questions about human philosophy. Others were trying to understand concepts like humor and art. A few were even attempting to compose poetry. "Sir," Adams said in amazement, "one of them is asking what it means to dream." Morrison almost laughed. The perfect hive mind that had terrorized the galaxy was learning to think like individual humans. They were discovering creativity, curiosity, and independence for the first time in their existence. "Sir," Brooks interrupted, "the Coalition fleet is winning. We have destroyed or disabled over 30,000 enemy ships. The remainder are retreating." Parker checked her readings. "The Voidborn command ships are trying to cut themselves off from their own network to stop the spread of our virus." Morrison watched as the massive enemy vessels began to separate from their fleet. These were the largest Voidborn ships, the ones that controlled the hive mind. They were trying to save themselves by abandoning their smaller vessels. "Danny," Morrison ordered, "do not let them escape. Lock onto their command frequencies." Walsh's fingers flew across his controls. "Sir, I am boosting our signal strength. The virus will reach them whether they want it or not." The effect on the enemy command ships was immediate and spectacular. The massive vessels began to change course randomly. Some started spinning in each place. Others began broadcasting music across all frequencies. "Sir?" Adams reported with wonder in her voice. "The largest enemy ship is transmitting the complete works of human poetry." Morrison shook his head in amazement. The Voidborn had absorbed human literature from the internet databases they had accessed during the cyber attack. Now they were trying to understand concepts their species had never experienced. Admiral Zixtar's voice came over the communication system. "Captain Morrison, this is incredible. The enemy fleet is completely broken. How did you do this?" Morrison looked around at his crew. They were all smiling, proud of what they had accomplished together. 200 humans on one ship had defeated an enemy that had destroyed 12 star systems. "Admiral," Morrison replied, "we did what humans always do when faced with impossible odds. We found a way to turn our enemy's strength into their weakness. I do not understand. The Voidborn were powerful because they thought as one mind. Perfect coordination, perfect efficiency, perfect order. But perfection has a weakness, Admiral. It cannot handle imperfection." Morrison stood up and walked to the main view screen. Around them, the battle was ending. Voidborn ships were surrendering, retreating, or simply floating in space trying to understand their new individual thoughts. "We introduced chaos into their perfect system," Morrison continued. "Human creativity, human randomness, human illogic. Their network was designed to share information instantly across thousands of ships. So when we gave them human thoughts to share, those thoughts spread everywhere. And now?" Morrison smiled. "Now they are learning to think for themselves. Some will choose to keep fighting. Some will choose to explore art and music. Some will probably choose to become philosophers, but they will never again be able to act. As one perfect hive mind." General Kethavor's voice joined the transmission. The proud Altarian commander sounded very different than he had during the strategy meetings. "Captain Morrison, I owe you an apology. I called you cowards for bringing only one ship." "No apology needed, General. But I must understand. How did you know this would work?" Morrison looked at his crew again. Parker was coordinating with the Coalition fleet to accept enemy surrenders. Brooks was monitoring the retreating Voidborn ships to make sure they kept leaving. Walsh was already working on ways to improve their systems for next time. Adams was helping translate messages from confused enemy vessels. "General," Morrison said, "we did not know it would work. But humans have learned something important in our long history. When you cannot win by being stronger, you win by being smarter. When you cannot beat your enemy's strengths, you attack their weaknesses." The Liberty began to move slowly toward the Coalition fleet. The battle was over, and it was time to go home. "Sir," Parker reported, "final casualty count from the Coalition fleet. We lost 400 ships, but we saved over 2,000. Total Voidborn losses are estimated at 45,000 ships destroyed or captured." Morrison nodded. It had been a costly victory, but it was still a victory. The galaxy was safe, and the Voidborn would never again be able to threaten entire star systems. As the Liberty rejoined the Coalition formation, Morrison could see alien crews on other ships watching them with expressions of wonder and respect. The small human vessel that they had mocked as inadequate had just won the greatest battle in galactic history. "Sir," Adams reported, "we are receiving thousands of messages from the Coalition fleet. They all want to know the same thing. Which is? How did Earth know that one ship would be enough?" Morrison settled back into his command chair and smiled. Around him, space was filled with the lights of 3,000 Allied ships, all safe because 200 humans had refused to accept that some problems could not be solved. "Tell them," Morrison said quietly, "that humans have always believed that the right idea at the right time is worth more than 1,000 ships. Today, we proved it." The USS Liberty turned toward home, carrying with her the knowledge that humanity's greatest weapon was not their technology or their numbers. It was their refusal to think inside the box, their ability to find solutions where others saw only problems, and their stubborn belief that any challenge could be overcome with enough creativity and determination. The galaxy had learned something important about humans. When Earth sent one ship to a fleet war, it was not because that was all they had. It was because that was all they needed.